This is David Rodecker, and I'm going to demonstrate a new concept that we've introduced to our database called SQL Constants. And essentially what SQL Constants allow for is an easy way to deal with not having to hard code values in queries. So on the wiki here, it's found simply by searching SQL Constants, but they are a representational lookup of a value in a lookup table, and it'll return typically right now all they're supporting is integers, and this operation to be performed on LKP tables. It will allow for IntelliSense in SQL Management Studio. You don't have to rely upon hard-coded values, and then we might be able to use this to find dependencies, so we know when a lookup value is being used. So just by way of example, this is a before and after of what a query may look like. If we did a query where we wanted to know a particular destination where it's being hard-coded here, the destination ID of 72196, and similarly we could say, well, where the destination title is this particular name. So that of course works, but we end up with hard codings that again is not very sustainable. We don't know where it's being used, and if someone changes the name, it screws up the whole query plan. So instead, we're introducing SQL constant, which allows for us to say equals to this object in the database, and that object, it will return the value, and it will maintain constant even if the name underlined name is changed in the lookup table. So that's the basic usage of it. I'll go through an example of how to implement it. It's not being these SQL constants are created as required by lookup tables. So let me skip on over to SQL and show you where this is located. Actually, first the directions are here. Actually, in there's a table that defines all the lookup tables. So this table here actually has a full scope of all the objects in our database called lookup. So DIS, lookup cancellation, all the way down to about 90 or 100 of these things. So these are all of our lookup tables in our database. Along with that, we know the identifier, which is the primary ID, the description column name, and then what we would make the prefix for a constant function name, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, this is compiled daily through a job that automatically figures out all the lookup tables and infers these column names, and then pre-assigns this. But notice there's a couple of fields turned off, and these three fields here are defined as these settings. So the setting here is create constant functions, and that specifies that we should be creating a constant function for that lookup table. So it's turned off automatically for all the lookups, and I've only turned it on for a couple of them as I've found that we need them, starting with placement destinations as the example above showed. And so I'm going to go ahead and enable it for something else that we need, which is for the table for status of placement profile statuses. So PRO LKP status. I love this table because it identifies the status of in progress all the way through deleted of a profile. So I will look up this in the database. Oops, I always like to have that. The table name is equal to that. And I'm going to go ahead and change the value of the constant create functions to 1. So now that I've done that, the next time that this job runs, it will automatically create the functions. So I'll go ahead and manually trigger this right now. And out comes output of it created. It actually, every time it runs, it alters the existing functions just to tickle them and make sure they're there and correctly working. And it shows you that verbose output. So So don't be confused by the count. It represents a lot of different activities for the placements and the lookups being created. As I mentioned, there are a couple other settings though that we may want to delete the old functions. So if there may be lookup values that are no longer used or needed, this will remove them from the database, so we're not burdened by them. Not necessary, but we can do it. The other thing is we can put a where filter. Sometimes there's lookup values that aren't needed. This is true in the destination functions, that we have a lot of destinations, and I've disabled many of them from being included by putting in a filter, and we can see that here, where I say where is disabled is equal to 0 is my filter. So I want to make sure that I'm only getting the ones that are not disabled. So now that I've done this, if I refresh my IntelliSense, which is an option in SQL, I can go to Edit, IntelliSense, refresh local cache, and hopefully that does its thing. But now I can select dbo dot. Oh no, I'm not getting any IntelliSense. There we go. PLC. Actually, this is profile con, and I have my statuses here. So I have my status completed, deleted. So if I want to say what's the status for in progress, that'll return 1. And similarly for all the other statuses, if it's published, it will now return 4 or 8. So in code, instead of saying if I want to select the top profiles that are published, I'll just say where eStatus ID is equal to status published, and voila. So that's our brief usage and of how we're going to use SQL Constants, and I hope that we can get away from more hard coding and more specific managed code.